Hello everybody, how are you? In this class we are going to deal with the last Tsar in Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanov dynasty. He was the last Tsar in Russia. His reign started in 1894 and finished when he abdicated in 1917, when Russia was in the middle of World War II. In fact, Russia quit the war in 1917 with the Russian Revolution, but that is something we are going to study later. Nicholas II succeeded his father, Alexander III, and he was the last of the Romanov dynasty. He was not a very strong man. He wanted to impose autocracy. He wanted to impose absolutism, to continue with the policy of his father, Alexander III, but he was too weak for that. He was a man that preferred family life to public affairs, and in fact, during his reign, he succumbed to the power of stronger personalities, as for example, his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, and also Rasputin, her lover, and I will tell you later why Rasputin was very important for the chaotic situation in Russia at that time. His ministers, Nicholas II's ministers, were also incompetent, and that is why Russia suffered a lot during the reign of Nicholas II. In fact, there were two famines because people were starving. Continuing with Tsar Nicholas II, I have to tell you that the civil service, the army, and the secret police ran the country for the Tsar. There was no parliament and any opposition to the government. So why wasn't there any opposition to the government? There wasn't any opposition to the government because any person suspected of speaking against the Tsar or being suspected of plotting against the Tsar was assassinated, was killed, or was put down with tortures and persecutions and things of the sort. So, at the beginning of the 20th century, most of Russia's population, approximately 125 million people, only 15% lived in towns and cities. But 50 years before, the peasants had been freed, remember, from the serfdom. However, by the beginning of the 20th century, many of them were in serious debt. If you remember, the program started by Alexander II, taking the lands from the nobles and giving them to the village communities, was really tricky, because peasants had to pay to the state in 70 annual installments. So they were slaves of the state, and that is why they had incurred in so high debts that they couldn't have a proper life. So at the beginning of the 20th century, as I said, many of them were hungry. Half peasants had difficulty supporting themselves. There was a famine in Russia in 1891 and another in 1901 and 1902. But what happened? At that time, Russia was beginning to industrialize. Foreign investment was bringing new industries to Russia. Russia was the fourth largest industrial power in the world. Factories and towns grew up exceptionally and with little or no control. So that was the problem. As peasants moved to these new towns and mining areas for work, slums grew where conditions were very grim and were very poor. While the Tsar and his family lived in beautiful palaces, where an army of servants in gorgeous costumes moved through the polished halls and silken chambers, the condition of the ordinary people were very different. And I want to make a pause here, because there was a very important man, Father Gapon, a father who belonged to the Orthodox Church, who held opposition to the Tsar. He spoke his mind, and he led many of the Russians to demonstrations in order to show, not against the Tsar, but in order to show the Tsar how poor people lived in terrible conditions. So it is very important to remember this name, Father Gapon. So according to Father Gapon, people received miserable wages, that is to say the people who worked in industries, and usually lived in overcrowded state, often in special lodging houses. It was common to see 10 or more people living in one room and 4 sleeping in one bed. And sometimes men worked 14 or 15 hours a day. So even though trade unions were illegal, strikes were organized to try to improve working conditions, and Father Gapon was an active member of these demonstrations. Nicholas II ruled over a vast empire. It stretched from Poland in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east, and included many different nationalities. For example, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Poles, Jews, and Germans. Compared with the situation at the beginning of the 19th century, the non-Russian population had grown, and this was to be a very serious issue for Russian governments throughout the 20th century. The conditions of the non-Russian people were very difficult. The Tsar followed the policy of Russification. Do you remember Russification? So he forced all nationalities, Poles, Finns, Jews, the nationalities we mentioned, to become Russian. They were forced to use the Russian language for business and in school. The Russian Orthodox religion became more important than Roman Catholicism or Islam, which were other major religions in Russia. However, the Jews, who were numerous in Western Russia, suffered the most. They had to live in certain designated areas, and they were discriminated and persecuted. The Tsar organized attacks called pogroms, and Jewish property and Jewish home were taken by the government. And this policy of Russification, that is to say, making everyone Russian, was unpopular and met with resistance. For example, the Finn resistance, in which the governor of Finland was assassinated. So it is very important to take into account this policy of Russification. But when Nicholas II realized that people were starting to turn against him, in order to divert attention, he entered a war with Japan, the Russian-Japanese War of 1904 for Manchuria. Remember this name, please, Manchuria, in China, because Japan and Russia wanted to conquer Manchuria, which was a very, I would say, rich territory. So Nicholas II entered the war against Japan, the Russian-Japanese War, and it was a disaster. He was advised by the Minister of War that this war was going to be very easy. It was going to be a walk in the park for Russia, but it didn't result in that way. It was really complicated for Russia, which received a complete defeat on hands of the Japanese. And this brought about more misery, more hunger, more famine, and people in Russia were decided to organize a demonstration and started to plot against the Tsar. This was the 1905 revolutionary movement against Tsar Nicholas II that we are going to explain in our next class. See you. Bye-bye.